Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. We are about to take a look at our first zombie heresy here. The zombie heresy is an old false teaching in the church that was overcome in the past, but still periodically comes back to shamble around and cause trouble. And today I have got one of these zombies right here. This was a popular book about a decade ago, but at the same time, it is also one of the oldest and therefore most rotten zombies around. And this is a book called The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. And if I were to summarize the message of this book in a single sentence, it would be, "Ye shall be as gods." And so what's The Secret all about? I was going to read a couple short quotes here. "Throughout history, there have been many who coveted the knowledge of the secret, and there have been many who found a way of spreading this knowledge to the world." Well, what kind of people? Well, poets such as William Shakespeare, Robert Browning, and William Blake delivered it in their poetry. Musicians such as Ludwig van Beethoven expressed it through their music. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci depicted it in their paintings. Great thinkers including Socrates, Plato, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Pythagoras, Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo shared it in their writings and teachings. Their names have been immortalized, and their legendary existence has survived for centuries. So, yeah, apparently all these people were teaching the secret. And if you have the pleasure of not knowing what the secret is, it's basically what people call the law of attraction, or in slightly older terms, the power of positive thinking. The idea being like supposedly attracts like. So if you think about bad things are going to happen to you. And if you think about good things, well, then good things are going to happen to you. Your thoughts determine reality. That's what the secret is. I wish I were making that up. I'm not. But yeah, I mean, if you gain wealth, not by being good with money or by working hard or by trading or making good picks in investments and that sort of thing. No, you gain wealth by thinking wealthy thoughts. And you lose wealth by thinking unwealthy thoughts, even if you're worried about not having enough money. That makes you not have enough money, right? Food doesn't make you fat. It's fat thoughts that make you fat. Disease, if you're sick, that's the result of negative thoughts. So, if you've got cancer, it is your own fault for thinking about having cancer. Aging is all in your head. You won't age unless you think about aging, unless you think you're going to get old. So, how can that be? How does that all work? Well, here's the explanation. We're just getting to the end of the book here. Most people define themselves by this finite body, but you're not a finite body. Even under a microscope, you're an energy field. What we know about energy is this. You go to a quantum physicist and you say, "What creates the world?" And he or she will say, "Energy." Well, describe energy. Okay, it can never be created or destroyed. It always was, always has been. Everything that ever existed always exists. It's moving into form, through form, and out of form. You go to a theologian and ask the question, "What created the universe?" And he or she will say, "God." Okay, describe God. Always was and always has been. Never can be created or destroyed. All that ever was, always will be. Always moving into form, through form, and out of form. You see, it's the same description, just different terminology. So if you think you're this meat suit running around, think again. You are a spiritual being. You're an energy field, operating in a larger energy field. How does all of this make you a spiritual being? For me, the answer to that question is one of the most magnificent parts of the teachings of The Secret. You are energy, and energy cannot be created or destroyed. Energy just changes form, and that means you. The true essence of you, the pure energy of you, has always been and always will be. You can never not be. So yeah, energy is God. Energy and God are basically the same things. And you are energy. So accordingly, yeah, ye shall be as gods. And it's all garbage, absolutely. And that's certainly not what any Orthodox Christian theologians are going to be telling you about God. And it's nonsense, fat thoughts make you fat. I mean, then explain the freshman 15. You go to college and you gain 15 pounds immediately because you're, determining your own diet for the first time in your life. And you don't think about it. Nobody goes to college thinking, oh, I'm going to start gaining weight. It happens anyway. So, yeah, obviously it's not being attracted by the way, it's being attracted by the eating habits. And as for things like age and disease and all that, all those wise men that she mentions who knew the secret and who taught the secret in all their works, there's one other thing besides the secret that all these people have in common. What do Shakespeare, William Blake, Beethoven, Da Vinci, Plato, Socrates, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and all of them, what do all these people have in common? Yeah, they're dead. All of them are dead. Their corpses are rotting in the ground or turned to dust already. That is what they all have in common. It's any health, abundance, and joy that they have is by no means perceptible at this point. And while some of them may very well be enjoying life in abundance in heaven, others from that list probably aren't. But the secret it's really just one example of what we've come here to talk about today, and that is the ancient heresy called Gnosticism. It's just a repackaging of these old ideas. And Gnosticism is one of the first heresies that the church had to deal with. And it's early enough that you can even see this in the New Testament. Some of John's epistles, for example, deal with Gnosticism a little bit. So it was already there a little bit in the first century and into the second century in particular. And up until that point, the major challenges faced by the church were all external. You had civic oppression from Rome, persecution by the Jews. Those were the big challenges that the early Christians had to deal with. And the result of those challenges was that you had a very tightly knit Christian community with a very strong identity over and against the rest of the world. And Gnosticism, though it really came from outside that community, Gnosticism was springing up from inside that close community, so it provided a different challenge to the church at that time. So what is Gnosticism? Well, it is actually a little bit hard to pin down. It's very similar to the New Age movements of the last century. Gnosticism is also the kind of this eclectic blend of a lot of different elements. But despite the blend, despite it kind of being all over the place some of the time, there are some common threads to Gnosticism. And the big one, of course, would be secret knowledge. And that's where the term comes from. The word Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. Because the idea is being a Gnostic meant that you were being inducted into the secrets of the universe. The special knowledge that only the elite few were aware of. And, basically it has the same kind of dynamic that you find in, in secret societies like Freemasonry or cults like Scientology, where you're moving up through the ranks by obedience to their system. And at each rank, each time you ascend to a higher level, more of these secrets are revealed to you. And these secrets are supposed to give you, power in this life and in the next. And when we're talking about Gnosticism with respect to Christianity, where we're springing up inside the church, the contention would be that salvation ultimately comes through the acquisition of these secrets, not by grace through faith, but by learning the secret knowledge of the universe. Like the book, how do you achieve eternal life and happiness while escaping all the bad things that we encounter in life? Well, it's through the secret knowledge. So that's the first big common thread in Gnosticism, secret knowledge. Next big thread is that Gnosticism is generally dualistic. And what I mean by dualistic? Well, there are two types of people in the world, right? Those who divide people into two groups, and those who do not. Gnostics are the kind who divide everything up into two groups. Specifically, Gnostics divided the world up into matter and spirit. Those are the two basic realities of this universe, matter and spirit. And they saw matter, the world around us, our own bodies, our own flesh. Matter was inherently wicked. It was inherently evil. It was a prison for the spirit. It's something that never should have been in the first place. Spirit, however, spirit is good. It's essentially good. It's what humans truly are. It's that spark of the divine in every human being, right, that they hear about. Gnosticism always revolved around recognizing that spark and freeing it from its fleshly shackles, escaping the prison of this material world around us. And if this starts to sound familiar a little bit, it's not just in The Secret. I mean, this idea is literally everywhere in pop culture these days. But to just give you one iconic example of this, have you ever seen that really, really old movie, The Empire Strikes Back? Well, there's a scene there where Yoda, the Jedi Master, he's training Luke on how to use the Force, and he's telling Luke to lift his X-Wing, his spaceship, out of the swamp. And Luke says, I can't. It's just too big. It's too hard. And then Yoda gives that famous line, right? Size matters not. Judge me by my size, do you? And well, you should not. For my ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. Well, why is the Force such a powerful ally? Well, because it's transcendent. Yoda says it surrounds us. It binds us. It penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. It's the real thing. Every matter is everything else. Is unimportant in comparison to the Force. That's why he tells Luke, he's like, oh no, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter, as he pinches Luke's arm. And then, of course, Yoda, he lifts the spaceship out of the swamp just fine, because Yoda understands the true nature of things. He knows the Force. Luke, in contrast, he fails because he just can't believe the secrets. So yeah, I mean, Yoda, everybody loves Yoda. Oh, he's so wise, he's so mysterious, but he's a Gnostic. And so much of our pop culture is based on Gnosticism. And increasingly, naturally, so much of our philosophy, so much of the broader culture is based on Gnosticism as well. Every time we say, oh, there's no difference between men and women, or we say that, men can be women, why not? Well, and they say, well, because biology is irrelevant. Our bodies don't matter. It's the spirit. It's what's inside us that really counts. I mean, heck, every time that you say that, oh, it's what's on the inside that really counts, as though our bodies are irrelevant, and though none of this matters. We're just meat suits worn by our spirits, and the spirit is the real thing. I mean, that's all this same kind of matter-spirit dualism that you find in Gnosticism. Matter is bad. It's evil. It shackles and imprisons us. But spirit's good. It's powerful. It sets us free. That's the big dualism in Gnosticism. But it's not the only one as well. There's also a dualism between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this biblical dualism really follows from the matter-spirit dualism, because given how you view matter is evil, the material world is evil, Gnostics would necessarily have a pretty different view of the creator of that universe. And they identified Yahweh as something called the demiurge. And at best, he was this kind of heavenly garbage man. That there was a reason for creating the world, but it's really a nasty business. I mean, it was a necessary evil, but it was an evil nonetheless. At best. At worst, other Gnostics would identify the creator as Satan, as the ultimate evil, that he was this villain whom Adam and Eve were right to oppose, and that when they ate of the tree of knowledge, right, they got this secret knowledge that God was trying to keep from them. That was a wonderful act that set humanity on the road, becoming like gods themselves and recovering that latent divine nature that was trapped within them. So yeah, this complete inversion where Satan is the good guy and God is the bad guy. Very Luciferian. And as a result of that, you have this very severe break between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Whereas Christians teach that Christ came in fulfillment of the Old Testament. Gnostics taught that Jesus came to free us from the Old Testament, to repudiate the Old Testament, get rid of it. Not just save us from our sins or save us from the curse of the law, but free us from our imprisonment in this evil world created by that God of the Old Testament. So that's the other big thread in Gnosticism, these dualisms between matter and spirit, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And lastly, Gnosticism was always very syncretistic, meaning that they made a regular practice of trying to adopt ideas and terms from other religions and incorporate them into their own system. Borrowing was their way of life. Today we'd call it cultural appropriation or religious appropriation, I guess. But that's just kind of how they operated. They took aspects of Persian, Babylonian, Oriental mysticisms, and they mix in Greek philosophy and blend it until smooth. And that's really how it got involved in Christianity as well, because Gnostics, they saw Jesus as somebody that they could take under their wing and incorporate into the Gnostic system. They saw this new element that they were able to add to their spirituality. And you see very much the same thing today when you look at people who are spiritual but not religious. People who claim that Jesus, he's a great prophet, or he's a guru, or he's a Buddha, or he's some other version of a great teacher who knew the secret, right? It's standard for the spiritual but not religious folk to grab a few Bible verses, recontextualize them in their own system, and pretend that Christianity is therefore compatible with their own spiritual system. It's not. I mean, it never is. Jesus isn't something you can borrow. Jesus isn't someone that you can kludge until you can make him fit into your own beliefs. But they try nonetheless, and the Gnostics did that as well. And ironically, they saw themselves as purifying Christianity, making it better. And again, you get that same kind of attitude today. It's releasing people from the bondage of the rules and traditions of the religion in which they were raised, and we're getting to the real Jesus, who is really not God, who didn't die for their sins, who's just this great teacher who has some kind of spiritual mumbo jumbo to pass on to you. And so they saw the Orthodox Church as something that had gone off the rails, and they, with their secret knowledge and their secret wisdom, they were just the ones to get it right back on track. And because of the syncretism, because they were borrowing so much, there were a lot of different varieties of Gnosticism, a lot of different varieties of things that you could call Gnostic. But we're just going to talk about two of the most prominent ones that affected the church most specifically. First one being Valentinian Gnosticism, which was named for its founder, Valentinus, who was a 2nd century Alexandrian. But that's really about all we can say for sure about him. Very little is known about Valentinus except for what his critics wrote about him. But he did seem to be some kind of teacher in the Alexandrian church. And, what did he teach? Well, part of what he taught was this really elaborate mythology surrounding this being known as Bythus. He was a supreme father. And Bythus is so supreme that he was supreme beyond knowing. He's this utter fullness that can't be grasped by anything else. He is so transcendent that he cannot relate to anything outside of himself, because he's just so much more and so much bigger than all of this. And that's a very big idea in Neoplatonic philosophy, which they're borrowing a lot from. And Bythus, he brings forth these other beings called aeons. These pairs of male and female divine beings that in turn they would bring forth more aeons, and one generation after a next, more and more aeons in each generation. And Bythus didn't create them per se; they're all emanations from him, right? Each of them was a kind of personification of Bythus, because Bythus himself, he's not a person; he's beyond personhood. You can know a person; you can't know Bythus. He's beyond anything like that. Fundamentally unknowable. But the aeons were a little bit different, because each of these emanations, at each generation of aeon, you get a little bit further and further and further away from Bythus. So each one's this kind of degradation or fragmentation of the supreme being. And therefore each generation of aeon was a little less transcendent, a little less unknowable, just a little less in general. And they all lived in this place called the Pleroma, which means fullness. It's this place of fullness. Everything's there. And there's no absence, there's no emptiness at all. Until you get to the last generation of Aeon, where one of them, named Sophia, she had a desire. And she desired to know Bythus. But as we all know, Bythus, he's fundamentally unknowable. He can't possibly know Bythus. And so this introduced emptiness, an unfulfilled and an unfulfillable desire into this place of fullness. And the result is this contradiction. You have fullness and emptiness next to each other, right? And this is what results in the creation of the physical world. It's a way to kind of encapsulate the emptiness and get it away from the fullness. And so the physical world is created specifically to be a place of unfulfilled desires, which is why we're all suffering in the world all the time. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, what does any of this have to do with Christianity? And the answer is, this is all framed as a kind of a prelude to Genesis 1. The world was without form and void. Oh, it's empty, right? Empty. Clearly, that's exactly what the Bible is saying about the world. And the demiurge gave a kind of shape to it. He let there be light and let there be this and that. And Valentine's had the garbage man view of the demiurge, who had to clean up and organize this mess in the pleroma somehow. And that's how the world was created. That's why humanity is created. That's why we're here. But, and here's the big catch here, the problem that Gnosticism sought to solve was that some measure of that spirit from the pleroma, these aeons, these emanations of the divine, some of that spirit is trapped in the physical world that the demiurge created. There's basically a mistake that was made, and that spark of the divine, that spirit, was trapped in certain people, specifically in the Gnostics, of course, because the Gnostics, who were able to come to this secret knowledge, they had a spiritual nature, right? They had spirit trapped within them. Ordinary Christians who hadn't quite made the leap to the Gnostic heresy, they had some measure of salvation. They had some kind of spirit, but they had less of a spiritual nature than the Gnostics were. They had a psychic nature, is how they describe that. But everybody else, Jews and pagans and so forth, they were just matter. They didn't have any spirit at all. They were purely material nature and therefore doomed. So, you really wanted to be one of the people with the secret knowledge, because that meant you had the spiritual nature, right? And so naturally, you have the Bible reframed in this Gnostic theology, mythology about creation. And so you have a very, very different gospel as well. The gospel is a revelation from Bythus that, when properly decoded, would help the Gnostics to recognize themselves as these spiritual beings, as gods. Again, ye shall be as gods. That's what this is all about. And release themselves from this material bondage, and that's how they would attain salvation. Christ, he was considered a kind of messenger of Bythus, not Bythus made flesh. Bythus cannot be made flesh. That's total fullness, total emptiness. That's a complete contradiction. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Nonsense. The Gnostics couldn't go for something like that. Matter is not a product of the divine will. It's inherently evil. God could not possibly become man. And so they were Docetists, meaning that they didn't think Jesus had a material body at all. He had the appearance of having a material body, but he was really just a spirit, almost a ghost, walking around in their view of things. So yeah, gospel is totally different. Jesus is totally different. The ideas of sin and ethics, those are totally different. In this version, in this theology, humans are the victims of evil. They're not the participants in evil. They're not doing anything. It's all Sophia's fault, and that we're trapped in this evil matter. So the Gnostics did not have the concept of sin, as we understand it. Certainly no guilt, because it's not anybody's fault. We're just trapped. We're all just victims. And naturally, ethics become very, very different as well. If matter doesn't matter, then you basically have two options. Either you go with extreme asceticism, you're whipping yourself and mortifying the flesh all the time because the flesh doesn't matter, and you're just trying to prove to yourself and everybody else that your flesh doesn't matter. So you either go that route, or you go to an extreme hedonism. Matter doesn't matter. Therefore, you can do whatever you want with it. You can enjoy yourself however you want, and nothing makes any difference. So Gnostics would usually go to either one of those two extremes, depending on which group you're talking about. And as far as the Bible goes, it's an allegory. It's something that you have. It's not straightforward historical narrative or even poetry or anything like that, or exhortations or teachings. It's all allegory, and it has to be decoded. And of course, the Gnostics were the ones with the secret decoder ring who were able to tell you what the Bible really means. Basically, you had to read the Bible like a conspiracy theorist, trying to read between the lines and trying to find out the hidden message behind every verse. And so, yeah, that's Valentinian Gnosticism. It's a totally different religion at this point, even though it used some Christian terminology, which is why we call it a heresy. It's a different God, it's a different gospel. Salvation is just escape from the material world. It's this kind of supernaturalization of humanity. The other major version of Gnosticism that troubled the early church was Marcionism. This is probably the bigger one. Marcion was also mid-2nd century. We know a little bit more about him. He was a wealthy ship owner. He was the son of a bishop in the church. And he was also excommunicated for causing schisms because of all the weird stuff that he was teaching. But he decided he wasn't going to let it sit there. He was going to start his own church. And it's this bigger, better church. He's going to take his ball and do things his way. And so he created his own church, and this church was successful enough that at least some people were seriously asking the question, well, which church is going to prevail in the end? And Marcion, he had really stressed that dualism between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He repudiated the Old Testament entirely. For him, the God of the Old Testament was the author of all evil. It's certainly not Jesus' father in any way, shape, or form. So this is more the demiurge as Satan approach to the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is mean, but Jesus is not mean. Jesus is of course, much more loving and much more merciful. And again, you get a lot of that same attitude today. The God of the Old Testament, he's mean and he's strict and he's just killing people every which way all the time. But Jesus, he is nice, he's fluffy, he's loving, and we've never heard a fly, never had a mean bone in his body. Basically the people who never actually read the Bible. And Marcion, well, he had the same problem, which is why he only accepted the Gospel of Luke and Paul's epistles. So those were the entirety of Scripture for Marcion. Everything else he threw out. And even those were heavily edited, specifically to remove a lot of the Old Testament stuff from them. Marcion taught that the Old Testament patriarchs were all damned, whereas Cain and the Sodomites, etc., they were all saved. They were the good guys in the Old Testament. And that the fall is a good thing because, you're rebelling against this horrible creature, this demiurge. So trying to escape his vile clutches is, of course, that's what you're supposed to be doing. And Christ, once again, he's a messenger of the true God, who, again, he's giving us this message which allows us to escape the material world. So you have the same kind of dualism. And interestingly enough, Marcion had a dualism between law and gospel as well. Specifically, gospel as love and law as justice, separating those two out. And Lutherans talk about law and gospel too. We make a distinction between the two, of course. But Marcion was the first to do this, and he didn't make it as a distinction. He made it as this total separation, that the law is what this one God taught, the God of the Old Testament taught, and the gospel is what this other God taught. Two different words from two different beings. Which should serve as a warning to some of the so-called radical Lutherans among us who also want to try to make law and gospel these two diametrically opposed, irreconcilable words, as opposed to two reconcilable words. For Christians, law and gospel are reconciled at the cross. That was the whole point of what Jesus was doing there. Marcion had this supposedly true God who's behind Jesus, who is in opposition to the God of the Old Testament. And a God who wasn't really doing a whole lot until Jesus appeared, because you have, this evil God creating the world and imprisoning everybody here, and then this true, loving, merciful God did absolutely nothing for thousands of years until Jesus showed up, which earned Marcion the scorn of Tertullian, an early church father. He made fun of Marcion's God because he took so long to reveal himself, and in the meantime, as he put it, he couldn't produce even one sad little vegetable. He couldn't do anything at all to help people in the meantime. Marcion also taught that Jesus didn't have a physical body, of course, and indeed he wasn't even born. He cut off the nativity from Luke's gospel, and he wasn't born at all. Christ just suddenly appeared as an adult. And Marcion tried to emphasize grace, but he did so by completely eviscerating the biblical message, including the gospel. Because again, God, the true God, according to Marcion, is just so transcendent. He's kept safely aloof. He can't be directly involved with us. He can't really communicate with us, so he has to create these intermediaries like Jesus to go in between for us. So those were the two most prominent versions of Gnosticism in the early church. So why? That's the question I would ask myself. Why would anybody want to go for this as opposed to Orthodox Christianity? And there are a few reasons for that. Big one being the problem of evil. And this is something that troubles people today, still do. The problem of evil, this idea of why is there evil and suffering in this world if there's a good, all-powerful God out there? How can that be? But Gnosticism gives this kind of comprehensive and systematic account of why there is suffering in the world. Why is there evil in the world? And which is a question we all ask, right? We're suffering. Something horrible is happening. We're sick. Somebody dies. So we're in a terrible situation. And that's what we all ask. Why? Why? And Gnosticism gives a kind of answer for that. Well, the world is evil. It's this place of unfulfillable desires. We're trapped here and we got to escape. And it's an appealing answer to a lot of people because it's an answer in which we're not to blame. The Christian answer to the question is sin. That's why there's suffering in the world, because we choose to do evil things. But Gnosticism provides an example, an answer where sin isn't involved. We're not to blame. We're just the victims here. We haven't done anything wrong. Something where you don't have to repent, where you don't have to acknowledge the evil within yourself. And you can just imagine yourself to be this divine being, perfect being who's just trapped in bad circumstances. Gnosticism was appealing because of the difficulty people have sometimes grappling with certain aspects of the Old Testament. God does seem really mean sometimes. He's having the tribe of Israel, just annihilate other tribes completely. He sends this flood on the earth because humanity had been so wicked. There are a lot of things in the Old Testament are hard to understand. But in the Gnostic system, where you make a villain out of the God of the Old Testament, well, that makes it a lot easier to understand. Not easier to read, not easier to understand the Bible as a whole, certainly, but easier to. It makes it more comfortable because we're more comfortable with villains doing things like that than we are with God, a perfect, just, loving God doing things like that. That's hard for some people to imagine, even today. And lastly, the other big appeal of Gnosticism, which is the big appeal today, is that excitement of elitism, of secrets, where that's the power of mysticism, where you're understanding the deeper nature of reality. And by understanding more and more, you can manipulate reality. You can make the world more like you want it to be. You think that you can encounter God in your feelings, in your soul, in the depths of yourself. You can look inward and find God there. And again, that's very, very appealing to people who want to think more highly of themselves than they ought, people who don't want to repent of their sin, and people who are just bored with life. They're bored with the world around them, and they see something exciting, something they could latch onto, something they could, go down that rabbit hole and find a fantastical world that's more interesting to them than the one that they see around themselves every day. So there is a certain appeal to that, and it caught up a lot of people in the early church, and still catches a lot of people today who find it appealing for the same reasons. But this is where we're going to stop for today. We're going to talk about the reasons a little bit later on. So please like, comment, subscribe, share the video, share the audio if you're listening to the podcast, and join us next time, because next time we are going to start taking a look at, well, how did the church respond to this?